today's episode, we examine how one family mocked the Matterhorn and crossed a boundary even seasoned climbers won't. Above 13,500 feet, they didn't just ignore the danger, they desecrated the peak, shouting insults for a viral stunt. It was the kind of dumb, ego-driven choice that seasoned climbers spend years learning never to make. It was August 23rd, 2019, on the Hernley Ridge of the Matterhorn, at about 13,500 feet, just below the shoulder that leads into the summit pyramid. The Morrison family, 8 climbers moving in 2 loose groups, was approaching the final technical stretch of the route. The morning had started in their favor. Visibility reached more than 30 miles. Winds from the southwest held between 8 and 12 miles per hour. The temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, and the limestone ridge was dry under thin, filtered sunlight. The Hernley Ridge is built around steady movement and spacing. Climbers follow sections of solid rock broken by fixed steel cables drilled into the limestone. In places, the ridge narrows to less than 3 feet wide, with more than 3,000 feet of open air on either side. Progress depends on balance, clipped anchors, and careful foot placement. In late August, however, afternoon storms are common. Warm air rises from the valleys. Clouds build quickly, and exposed peaks begin to collect electrical charge when instability increases. Leading the group was Robert Morrison, 42, a real estate developer from Phoenix. With him were his wife Sandra, their twin sons Marcus and David, Robert's sister Elaine, and her husband Mark, and Mark's 2 adult children. None of the 8 had deep alpine experience beyond guided climbs of Mount Whitney and Mount Rainier. 2 local guides were assigned to the group, one ahead, one behind, to help manage spacing and cable transitions along the narrow sections. Robert carried a standard aluminum ice axe, steel crampons, trekking poles strapped to his pack, and a lightweight harness he clipped to fixed lines where required. A smartphone was mounted to his chest for filming. The goal was summit photos and family footage from the ridge. Weather had been discussed at the hut that morning, but there was no detailed briefing on lightning response beyond general awareness. The Matterhorn rises more than 4,000 feet above the surrounding terrain and often acts as a conductor when storm systems develop. As cloud base is lower and the difference in charge between sky and rock increases, static builds along ridgelines and metal fixtures. Fixed cables can begin to vibrate. Metal tools may produce a faint hum. In some cases, a small blue glow can appear at sharp metal points. The standard response in those moments is immediate descent. Earlier that week, 2 brief buildups had passed without incident. At 11:42 a.m., wind direction shifted from southwest to southeast. The change was slight but noticeable. Over the next half hour, clouds thickened over the Italian side of the peak. The ridge was still climbable. Nothing had failed, but the system was no longer steady. Their gear reflected a relaxed approach to a technical ridge. Robert carried a small mountaineering pack, a lightweight aluminum ice axe, and steel crampons they had purchased only weeks before the trip. Several members clipped inconsistently to fixed cables despite all wearing harnesses. In a short video recorded the night before, Sandra commented that most of the equipment felt excessive for what she described as just climbing some rocks. The Matterhorn is not built like a stable staircase. Its upper structure is mostly limestone, layered over older schist. The boundary between those rock types creates natural fracture lines. Stone loosens over time from freeze-thaw cycles, thermal expansion, and constant gravitational stress. The mountain's sharp pyramid shape is the result of that long erosion process. Steep faces and narrow ridges leave little space for climbers to step aside if debris begins to fall. Rockfall on the Hernley Ridge follows predictable daily patterns. Overnight, cold locks loose stones in place as water inside cracks freezes. After sunrise, warming temperatures expand the rock and weaken those bonds. By late morning, stones that held overnight can begin to shift. The most active period for natural rockfall is usually between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. when solar heating is strongest. Guides plan summit pushes early to move through exposed sections before warming increases the risk. Several parts of the ridge are known for loose rock collecting on ledges and in shallow gullies above the route. In those areas, climbers are expected to move carefully and avoid sudden movements that could dislodge debris onto teams below. Early warning signs include small pebbles sliding past boots, short bursts of dust drifting upward from impacts, and sharp metallic sounds when stone strikes fixed cables or anchors. That morning, the mountain showed no unusual signs. Wind remained light. There was no seismic activity. Temperatures followed normal late summer patterns. Still, guides had noted slightly increased rock movement in the previous 3 days, after a brief period of rain followed by clear, warmer weather. conditions that can accelerate loosening. The Morrison family left the Hernley hut at 4:45 a.m., following the standard pre-dawn departure used to reduce exposure to afternoon rockfall. Their pace through the first 1,000 vertical feet was steady, reaching that gain in about 90 minutes. The lower section of the route follows stable rock features with few objective hazards beyond footing and spacing. At that point, nothing appeared out of order. At approximately 7:30 a.m., the family reached the first true technical section of the Hernley Ridge, where the route shifts from steep hiking into sustained climbing. Fixed steel cables began appearing along the rock. From this point forward, the ridge narrowed and exposure opened on both sides. A slip no longer meant a stumble. It meant a fall of thousands of feet. Movement required steady spacing, secure hand placement, and efficient progress. Robert paused frequently to record photos and video. Family members were asked to stop, reposition, and repeat movements for better framing. Instead of moving through the section quickly, they lingered in exposed areas to capture wider angles and stronger reactions. The rhythm of safe progression slowed. Near a cluster of bronze memorial plaques set into the rock, markers honoring climbers who had died on previous attempts, the group gathered for another recording. Sandra read several names aloud in an exaggerated voice, while the others reacted for the camera. The twins stood directly on the metal plaques during the filming, using them as a part of the shot. Their tone was casual, but the setting was not. Robert commented that the plaques were reminders not to make the same mistakes, while panning across engraved dates from past accidents. Sandra added that better equipment made a difference, gesturing toward their own gear. The exchange was recorded as light content, but it showed a gap between the seriousness of the place and how they were treating it. As they climbed higher, the behavior escalated. The guides were positioned ahead and behind and temporarily out of line of sight. Along a section where loose stones rested on ledges above the route, Marcus nudged a small rock with his boot and watched it fall. David followed, pushing another stone free. The sound of rock striking rock echoed down the face. Robert filmed from a few feet away. What began as small debris turned into larger pieces being dislodged intentionally. Deliberately causing a rockfall violates a basic rule of alpine climbing. Stones can accelerate quickly and travel thousands of feet, striking climbers below who may not see them coming. Even small rocks can carry enough force to cause serious injury. The family did not check for other parties beneath them before continuing. By 9:15 a.m., they reached a narrower section of ridge where careful hand and foot placement became essential. Exposure extended more than 3,000 feet down the north face and nearly 4,000 feet down the east face. At this point, climbers typically shorten pauses and focus on secure movement. Instead, the group slowed again for photos. Sandra stood near the ridge crest with her arms extended for dramatic effect, while Robert adjusted angles. The twins took turns posing close to the edge. During one recording, Marcus loosened his grip briefly and pretended to slip while David filmed. The moment was controlled, but it introduced unnecessary movement on unstable rock. The ridge remained stable. The weather still held, but spacing had tightened. Loose debris had already been disturbed, and focus had shifted away from controlled movement. The system had not failed. It was being tested. Their casual attitude continued as the conditions around them began to change. The air temperature climbed from 28 degrees Fahrenheit to 34 degrees Fahrenheit as the sun warmed the upper ridge. Overnight freezing had held many loose stones in place, but with the rise in temperature, that bond weakened. Small pebbles began skipping down the rock faces above the route. The sound was light but steady. Sharp clicks and brief rattles that experienced climbers recognized as early rockfall warning. Robert noticed the movement but treated it as background activity rather than a hazard. He filmed the stones bouncing past their position, keeping the group in place longer than necessary. Instead of moving quickly through the exposed section, they lingered. Sandra and the others stayed clustered on a narrow stretch of ridge where most climbers normally pass without stopping. Their pace slowed. What should have been a steady push upward became repeated pauses for filming and repositioning. Every stop extended their exposure beneath loose terrain. The Hernley Ridge is designed for flow, short rests, controlled spacing, constant movement. Remaining stationary under warming rock increases risk with each passing minute. By 10:30 a.m., heating intensified across the upper face. Climbers higher on the ridge reported hearing larger stones breaking free in adjacent gullies. The sound changed from isolated clicks to a more constant backdrop of impacts echoing against the limestone. Rockfall activity was no longer occasional, it was spreading across multiple sections of the route. The Morrison family moved toward the louder areas, believing the terrain looked more dramatic for photos. Instead of following the established track, worn smooth by decades of careful route selection, they drifted toward looser ground where broken rock had collected in shallow pockets. Marcus pointed out a large boulder resting on a narrow ledge, roughly 40 feet above the main climbing line. It was roughly 5 feet high and estimated to weigh between 2 and 3 tons. The rock sat slightly tilted, its base resting on fractured limestone. Freeze-thaw cycles over many seasons had widened small cracks beneath it. Morning heat caused subtle expansion in the stone and the ledge below, reducing the friction that held it in place. The balance was already marginal. The added weight of climbers moving near its base would introduce new load into a system that was no longer stable. Robert and Sandra climbed up beside the large boulder and began taking photos that required them to lean their full weight against it. They braced their boots on the narrow ledge and pushed as if trying to make the rock move. Marcus stood a few feet away, filming on his phone while urging them to push harder. The stone sat on a slanted shelf of limestone that already showed small gaps beneath its base. The posing continued for nearly 20 minutes. Family members rotated in and out, pressing their shoulders and hands against the rock. At one point, David noticed that pushing on one side produced a faint grinding sound and a slight shift, no more than a fraction of an inch. Instead of stepping back, he called the others over to feel it move. The grinding grew clearer as more force was applied. Sandra began pushing in short, repeated bursts to recreate the sound, while Robert recorded. Each shove added pressure to contact points that were already limited. The rock rested on uneven edges, supported by friction and balance rather than deep anchoring. With every push and release cycle, small grains of limestone broke free. Tiny voids widened between the boulder and the ledge. The movement remained subtle, but the resistance was weakening. By approximately 11:45 a.m., the combined effects of warming rock, gravity, and repeated loading shifted the stone's center of mass. The support zone beneath it had narrowed. Marcus was now standing directly behind the boulder, camera raised, as Sandra leaned into it with her full weight. When the ledge edge finally gave way, the rock tilted outward. Its base lost contact and the several-ton mass rolled forward, dropping toward the main climbing route, roughly 40 feet below. The boulder's first movement was subtle. It shifted less than an inch at its base as weight transferred across the fractured contact points beneath it. The stone had been resting on 2 primary support edges and a smaller rear wedge of broken limestone. Repeated loading had already reduced friction along those contact surfaces. When Sandra stepped back and her boot displaced a small supporting fragment, the rear wedge fractured. The mass began to tilt outward. At first, the rotation was slow, measured, almost controlled. The boulder weighed several tons and stood roughly 4 feet high and 3 feet wide at its base. As it pivoted, the lower contact edge crumbled, and the center of gravity moved beyond the remaining support line. For roughly 2 seconds, the stone rotated, no more than 15 degrees. During that brief window, it was still technically recoverable if the mass had settled back. But the friction holding it in place had already failed, and gravity took over. Sandra recognized the movement and tried to shift laterally along the ledge. The space available was less than 2 feet wide, bordered by open air on one side and fractured rock on the other. There was no anchor line between her and the drop. As the boulder continued its rotation, its lower edge swept across the surface where she had been standing. When it struck her torso, the force was concentrated along the midsection. The force was sufficient to collapse the rib cage on impact. Her rib cage collapsed instantly under compression. The impact carried her off the ledge and onto the exposed face below. Marcus stood slightly behind the boulder's original position. When the stone's lower edge hit the lip of the ledge during rotation, the impact transferred force into the surrounding limestone. The rock fractured along existing fault lines. Large pieces sheared off. One fragment, approximately 2 feet across and weighing several hundred pounds, broke free and struck Marcus across the head and upper chest. The blow knocked him backward and over the edge. The fragment continued downslope, breaking apart on impact with lower rock. The main boulder, now fully committed to descent, struck a protruding outcrop roughly 8 feet below its original position. The collision split the stone along internal fissures. Half of the mass continued as a primary block. The remainder fragmented into multiple pieces, ranging from fist-sized debris to slabs weighing more than 200 pounds. The bouncing motion converted rotational movement into forward acceleration. Within seconds, the main mass reached an estimated speed of approximately 50 to 60 miles per hour as it moved down the fall line. Below the ledge, Robert and David had stopped on the primary climbing line, positioned roughly 20 feet downslope. The route there narrowed to less than 3 feet across, bordered by a near vertical drop. When the first fragments passed them, they had less than 2 seconds of warning. There was no lateral escape route. The fixed cable at that section was anchored against the rock face, offering no shelter from falling debris. If you want more mountain case studies grounded in real terrain, real mechanics, and real decision chains, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss the next breakdown. The primary block struck Robert directly across the upper torso. The impact produced catastrophic blunt force trauma, collapsing the chest cavity and forcing him backward against the rock wall before he was carried off the route. David was hit first by fast-moving fragments, and then by Sandra's falling body, which had already accelerated over more than 20 vertical feet. The combined force caused a fatal cervical spine fracture and severe head trauma. Both were pushed from the ledge within seconds of one another. From first movement to final impact, the sequence lasted approximately 12 seconds. The main boulder continued another 300 vertical feet, striking protruding shelves and breaking apart into a wide debris field. The largest remaining section came to rest against a slanted limestone bench, roughly 280 feet below the original ledge. Smaller fragments spread outward across a fan-shaped area nearly 60 feet wide. Helmets, gloves, a broken trekking pole, and 2 phones were scattered among the rock. Climbers positioned about 200 feet above the fall line initially registered the sound as routine morning rockfall. It was only when dusk cleared that they saw equipment lying across the route and multiple bodies, motionless, on separate shelves. Robert's body was located on a narrow ledge, approximately 240 feet below the original position. He had come to rest on his knees with his upper body folded forward over the rock slope, helmet partially crushed beneath him. The position appeared almost bowed, but it was the result of gravity and the angle of the incline. His harness remained intact, though unclipped from any fixed line. Sandra was found roughly 30 feet downslope from Robert, positioned against a shallow depression in the rock where debris had collected. The fall and impact had caused extensive blunt force injuries. Her ice axe lay several feet away, embedded in loose fragments. Marcus had fallen farther, coming to rest near the edge of the debris field, approximately 310 feet below the original ledge. He was located adjacent to one of the larger fractured stone pieces that had broken from the main mass. His helmet had separated during impact and was found higher up the slope. David's body was recovered on a lower rock shelf, about 20 feet from Marcus, partially shielded by accumulated debris. The distribution pattern matched the sequence of impacts reconstructed later by investigators. None of the 4 showed any signs of movement after initial impact. Radio contact with Zermatt Rescue Coordination was established at approximately 12:15 p.m. The first report described multiple climbers struck by falling rock with no visible movement. A helicopter launched within 45 minutes, once wind conditions stabilized. Aerial assessment confirmed the severity of injuries before any personnel were lowered. Based on visible trauma and positioning, the mission shifted from rescue to recovery before ground contact. Recovery operations required 2 full days due to terrain instability. The debris field remained active. Small stones continued to fall intermittently as sunlight warmed the fractured limestone. Long-line helicopter techniques were used to lower rescue technicians one at a time onto each shelf. Each position required anchor assessment before any movement. The bodies were secured individually in recovery bags and lifted vertically to avoid dislodging additional rock. Larger fragments were left in place unless they posed a direct hazard to other climbers moving through the route. The 4 surviving family members, Sandra's sister Elaine, her husband Mark, and Mark's 2 adult children, were located higher on the ridge at the time of the collapse. They had not been in the immediate fall line, but witnessed the event from less than 40 feet away. None sustained physical injuries. However, they were unable to descend immediately due to shock and the temporary closure of the route while rescue coordination began. Guides secured them to fixed anchors and stabilized their positions until clearance was given to move. They were escorted down in stages under supervision of mountain guides and rescue personnel. The descent took several hours due to congestion and safety spacing requirements. Once at Hernley Hut, they were evaluated for minor abrasions and dehydration, but required no advanced medical intervention. They were transported to Zermatt later that evening for formal statements as part of the accident investigation. The ridge reopened only after debris stabilization and safety reassessment were completed. The 4 survivors returned to the valley, physically unharmed. The mountain environment remained unchanged. The consequences of the collapse were limited to the debris field, the equipment scattered across the slope, and the absence of 4 climbers who had been standing there minutes earlier. Investigators found cameras, phones, and mounting equipment scattered across the debris field. Several devices were still intact. The recovered footage provided a clear timeline of events in the minutes before the collapse. Video showed repeated interaction with a large, unstable rock near the memorial site. The recordings confirmed that the group remained in close proximity to the boulder while applying force to it, despite visible movement and shifting debris around its base. The official report issued by Swiss authorities confirmed that 4 members of the Morrison family died from blunt force trauma caused by direct boulder impact and secondary rockfall. Forensic findings documented injuries consistent with multi-ton stone impact, including severe chest compression, skull fractures, cervical spine disruption, and catastrophic blunt force trauma consistent with high-mass rock impact. Video recovered from personal devices confirmed that the boulder had been subjected to repeated pushing and loading in the minutes leading up to its release. Geological assessment determined that the rock had been resting in a position of marginal stability, supported by limited contact points against fractured limestone. Freeze-thaw cycles and seasonal erosion had already reduced its structural support. Investigators concluded that the additional force applied by the group accelerated the failure by shifting the rock's center of gravity beyond its balance point. Experienced climbers typically avoid contact with loose rock and exposed terrain and move quickly through unstable sections to limit exposure time. After the incident, the Hernley Ridge was temporarily closed while mountain rescue teams and local guides inspected adjacent rock bands for additional instability. Several loose blocks near the memorial site were removed or stabilized, and spacing protocols were reinforced for guided groups moving through that section. Updated advisories now emphasize strict non-interference with unstable rock and immediate reporting of any shifting stone along the route. The investigation confirmed that the collapse was not spontaneous. The boulder had been resting in marginal balance, supported by limited contact points already weakened by seasonal freeze-thaw cycles. Added force shifted its center of gravity beyond its support line. Once that threshold was crossed, gravity dictated the rest. 4 climbers were positioned directly in the fall line when the mass released. They had treated the ridge as something to play with. The ridge responded according to physics. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, click here.